Hey folks, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to EQ snare drum in just 3 steps. We're going to be looking at EQing snare drum today, but before we dive in, if you are looking to dial in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for Mixing Drums workshop. This workshop is going to walk you through the 3-step process that I use on almost every single one of my mixes for getting professional sounding drum mixes and right from your home studio. It is a 100% free to watch, on-demand video training, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at this snare drum. I'm going to hit play here so you can hear the drums inside this mix here, and then I'll solo up the drums so you can hear them a little bit closer to the snare drum, and then I'll take everything out but the snare drum so you can hear it by itself as well. So here's our finished mix for this song.
Look through any window, yeah, any time of day. See the drivers on the road, running down the heavy load.
So you can hear our snare drum's got some nice crack up on the top end. It's got that nice blossom of air that you want when the drummer hits the snare drum. You want to hear that top end air on the snare, but it also has some nice body on the bottom end here. So let's go through. I'm going to take off these plugins here, and we're just going to start by looking at our first EQ here on the snare drum. So you can see we've got a couple moves here. We're going to break everything down into just 3 steps. So I'm going to take off these moves on the top end here. Step number 1 for me when it comes to EQing snare drum is always a high pass filter. And in a larger sense, getting rid of the information that you don't need. Before we do any kind of compression, before we do any kind of boosting, you want to trim out all of that information that you don't need to make room for everything else. So here on the snare drum, take a listen without the high pass filter, and then I'll kick it in. You can hear the difference here. It's a subtle difference there. I'm not cutting too much into the low end, into the body here on the snare drum. We're at about 90 hertz. You can see our fundamentals sitting upwards towards 200 here. So I don't want to cut too much into that, but I want to reduce any kind of information, whether it be bleed from the kick drum or any kind of tom rolls or stuff like that, or just low end information, air blasts going into the microphone that's on the snare drum. I want to get rid of all that information and make room for when we highlight the fundamental later down the road. So that's step number 1, and you can take that further if need be, if you need to cut any low mid area or any kind of ringing in the mid range. Step number 1 is getting rid of the information we don't need on the snare drum. Now, before we jump into step number 2, I always throw my compressor in, so I'm going to click the compressor in here. I like to do step number 2 with a compressor in place following the EQ. So step number 2 is boosting top end or mid-range, high mid area on the snare drum. So pretty much emphasizing that top end area on the snare drum. And I like to do that into a compressor. I just like the way the compressor holds down top end boosts. So I put my compressor in place here after the snare drum, and now we're gonna get our top end boosts. The first one I'm gonna do here is this one up at 8K. You can see I'm boosting about 9.5 dB here at 8K. And this is going to open up that top end and give us all that air that we want to hear on the top end of our snare drum. So take a listen without this boost and then with it. So you can hear it's giving us that really pointy attack up on the top end, but it's also giving us a lot of air. Now it seems like too much here, but you've got to wait till we get everything else in place. Our snare drum's going to sound really tonally balanced. This sounds out of place by itself, but bear with me here, okay? So the next boost I like to do is usually around about 3K, and this is going to give you that nice high mid crack that's going to emphasize the stick attack there. So take a listen to this boost here at about 3K. It's giving us that extra crack and that extra attack coming from the high mid area on the snare drum. That's what that 3K boost is going to give you there. Anywhere in like 3 to 4K is going to give you that kind of crack or that emphasis on that stick attack on the top of the snare drum there. So we've got our air, we've got our attack, we've got our snare crack. This here is an extra boost. Sometimes you won't need it depending on what your snare drum sounds like, your snare recording. But we were lacking a little bit of the mid-range here to help our snare drum feel full. It was starting to feel a little bit like a smile curve here. So this 4.5, almost 5 dB boost at 1.5K is helping our snare drum feel more full range. So take a listen without this, and then when I kick it in, listen to how our snare drum kind of rounds out. This kind of boost here in the mid range or at 1.5K is also going to give you a big volume difference perception. It's not that crazy of a boost, a 4.5 dB boost, but it'll trick your ears into thinking your snare drum's quite a bit louder because we're going to perceive that mid range quite a bit more than everything else. So that step 2 here is emphasizing our top end area. So we've got our air, we've got our crack, and we've got our fullness here coming from our mid range boost. Now, going after our compressor now is where step number 3 comes into place. And you've guessed it here, you've probably seen me do this kind of stuff before if you've watched my videos. I like to boost bottom end after compression. So we get rid of what we don't need, that's step number 1. Step number 2 is emphasizing our top end area. And then step number 3, post compression, is where we bring up our bottom end to round out and give the snare drum that weight it needs to be competitive in the mix. So take a listen to this boost here. We're doing an 8 dB boost at about 150 hertz. It gives the snare drum quite a bit of oomph, but if you watch our meters here, the volume coming from the snare drum, the level doesn't change very much. It's just giving us all of that bottom end weight that we need for our snare drum to feel really heavy and really impactful inside the mix here. So let's A/B everything here on our snare drum now. So all 3 steps, getting rid of what we don't need, emphasizing the top end, and then bringing up that bottom end post compression. So here's before, and then I'll click everything back on. Three simple steps here to EQing your snare drum, getting rid of what we don't need, whether it's bottom end or low mid information, emphasizing the top end area, so that air and that high mid crack that we need, and then post compression, bringing up your bottom end to make your snare drum feel full and to help it be powerful and present in your mix. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to take your drum mixes to the next level and really start dialing in a repeatable workflow for your drum mixes, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for Mixing Drums workshop. It will help you dial in a professional and reliable process for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes every single time. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.